Welcome viewers to this lecture on George Eliot's Middlemarch. In this module, we will be looking at books 5 and 6. Book 5 is titled The Dead Hand and book 6 is titled The Widow and the Wife. I think one of the things that, book 5 particularly kind of pushes us into is this whole idea of political history in the novel. And we need to ask, what really speaking is the relationship between George Eliot's Middlemarch on the one hand, George Eliot's writing of the novel on the other, and the historical, the political history, really speaking, of the period. So, to quote Jeremy Beatty here, already we can see certain of George Eliot's techniques for handling political history. She introduces it largely through references to historical personages. She mentions but never explains issues. She scatters references to the same person or issue through the novel, rather than lumping them in a single paragraph or chapter. She separates the events from the dates. In other words, she presents history dramatically within the story as part of the lives of the characters. She rarely offers it directly to the reader as history. This is a very important point because we are analyzing here not simply Middlemarch, but we are analyzing novel written by a woman writer who chooses to use a male pseudonym for writing a novel. In the 19th century, a time period when you have a lot of women who are writing novels, writing towards the end of the 19th century, as in the 1870s, but someone who chooses to write about the late 1820s and early 1830s. Why is she doing that? That in itself gives us an indication that the social political history of that moment of the late 1820s and 1830s is what concerns her. So, Beatty is absolutely correct in stating this strategy that is used by George Eliot. She never makes it seem overtly about politics or overtly about history, but she scatters, the correct word is, she scatters these references to the same person, enough references to George IV, references to Wellington, to Peel. All these are people from history, figures from history. So she refers to them, but it's never as if, they are all lumped together in a particular chapter, or it's never as if the chapter is about them. They remain in the backdrop, but at the same time, the novel is about, the fictional plot that is playing out. But it has tremendous bearing on reality. It has tremendous connection with the history of that period. So, and she never really offers it directly to the reader as history. So I think before we begin actually with a discussion of the issues raised in these two books, I think George Eliot's approach to history, to politics, to the society, to her writing of the novel, her narrative technique, I think these are some very important points that have been brought in. Now, if we look at this, when we look at the interaction between Rosamund Vincy and Dorothea Brooke, married to, of course, Casaubon, to Rosamund, how does Rosamund perceive Dorothea Brooke? She always sees and looks at Dorothea as somebody who's way above her social station. And so, George Eliot, of course, mocks Rosamund when she says that to Rosamund she was one of those country divinities, not mixing with Middlemarch mortality, whose slightest marks of manner or appearance were worthy of her study. Moreover, Rosamund was not without satisfaction that Mrs. Casaubon should have an opportunity of studying her. So Rosamund, of course, has always tried to keep herself absolutely up with the times, but it is the way she looks at Mrs. Casaubon, that's the way she looks at Mrs. Casaubon, that's very interesting here. So, and now, Dorothea Brooke, on the other, Dorothea Casaubon, if we may call her that now, is again, on the one hand, she looks at her own marriage as dull, insipid. On the other hand, there is this inexplicable, bond that she shares with Ladislaw. And at the same time, she does not know how she should, really speaking, negotiate her life on her own terms. And she says that, yes, indeed, said Dorothea, brightening, I should be quite grateful to you if you will tell me how I can help to make things a little better. Everything of that sort has slipped away from me since I have been married. I mean, she said after a moment's hesitation, that the people in our village are tolerably comfortable, and my mind has been too much taken up for me to inquire further. But here, in such a place as Middlemarch, there must be a great deal to be done. This realization that after marriage, her desire, if we actually compare Dorothea and Lydgate, these are two characters. Both wanted to do something for the society, however theoretical it might be. But both fall on that aim, and they fail on that aim because both of them give themselves up to an institution that only kind of takes them further away from their aim. And this is the institution of marriage. And in a very, through this development of plot, George Eliot is offering a critique of marriage, showing us how it deprives Dorothea, despite the fact that she has the means, it deprives Dorothea of the chances of doing something in life. What that would be is a different matter. Whether that would materialize or not is again a different matter. But her realization that her desire that to help to make things a little better, and how this sort of a desire, everything of this sort has slipped away from her the moment she got married. Right. At the same time, we have Lydgate, who is equated with Bulstrode, and he responds, when Dorothea says all this to Lydgate, and there is everything to be done, said Lydgate with abrupt energy, and this hospital is a capital piece of work, due entirely to Mr. Bulstrode's exertions and in a great degree to his money. Throughout the novel, Lydgate is never quite comfortable with his proximity with Mr. Bulstrode. Yet at the same time, it's his money that is required. So there is a lot to be done, but things can't be done in the air. There is capital, there is money that is required. And the money is provided by Bulstrode. So which also goes back to a comment that is made earlier by the narrator itself about Bulstrode, about how he's ready to do a good turn, but then also severe to ensure that it fetches him the kind of social image that he really speaking wants to build. So the connection between Lydgate and Bulstrode is of course something that will have serious repercussions for him later. And he's also, as I said, uncomfortable with this, and he says that he did not have any connections with Bulstrode before he came to Middlemarch, and he has set things on foot, and he wants to do a good turn. But if a fair number of the better educated men went to work with the belief that the medical reform and practice is going to be the way it is, then we would see a change for the better. So he says that if he had refused to work with Mr. Bulstrode, then he would be turning his back on an opportunity for making his profession more serviceable. That if Bulstrode had not believed in his plans of a fever hospital, the new hospital, then obviously he would not have been able to achieve that aim. Now, and it's interesting to see, please remember about how Lydgate, is somebody who's establishing himself as a doctor. So he cures Fred Vincy, and he cures a lot of other people. And at the same time, he also wants to develop greater understanding of his own work right? Because his desire to actually study the anatomy of the corpses is something very, very important. It shows about how well aware George Eliot was about changes taking place in the medical world. So there's a character, Mrs. Dollop, who's more and more convinced that Dr. Lydgate is, he meant to let the people die in the hospital, if not to poison them, for the sake of cutting them up without saying that this is what he wanted to do. And what he really speaking what Lydgate wanted to do was to study the anatomy so that he could arrive at a better cure. And let's take a look at some of these quotes in the novel. One of the facts quickly rumored was that Lydgate did not dispense drugs because he was studying the way in which the body could be cured, without dispensing drugs. And this was offensive to physicians whose exclusive distinction seemed infringed on, and to the surgeon apothecaries with whom he ranged himself. And only a little while before, they might have counted on having the law on their side. So the physicians, or the 6 medical people who are mentioned in Middlemarch, and they're including Lydgate. So the 5 of them are extremely unhappy, of course, with the way Lydgate is gradually becoming popular. But his popularity is one part of the problem, but his new ways are the other part of the problem. His reform that he brings in the medical field is something that is problematic for the others. So the Middlemarch families were, of course, not going to change their doctor, so easily. But gradually, when they see the kind of work that he is doing, they do so. But not everybody toes the same line. So, does this Mr. Lydgate mean to say that there is no use in taking medicine? One of them asks. And another says, I see your meaning, Toller, said Mr. Hackbutt, and I am entirely of your opinion. I shall take an opportunity of expressing myself to that effect. A medical man should be responsible for the quality of the drugs consumed by his patients, is the rationale of the system of charging. So what is the medical man supposed to do? Is he only supposed to dispense drugs, or is he supposed to cure the patient in the best possible manner? And the best possible is one which is in tune with the times. So which means that there is a great churning that is happening in the medical field. This is a churning of modernity. So what does Lydgate then represent? Lydgate represents this voice of modernity, and in this book you see a lot of references to the medical world. So, for example, you have the case of Nancy and the tumor. According to Dr. Minchin, it was tumor, but Lydgate said it's just an ordinary cramp. So, at the same time, there was this refusal on the part of every medical man, to become a visitor at the fever hospital. Nobody wanted to go there because that would mean that you're supporting the new ways of Lydgate. So, not only these people, Rosamond herself, married to Lydgate, Rosamond herself, somebody who's trained into being an accomplished woman at Mrs. Lemon's, right? She's absolutely aghast at some of the things that Lydgate says, which tells us that there is absolutely no compatibility between Lydgate and Rosamond. Because on the one hand, you have Lydgate, who's totally dedicated to his profession, and then you have Rosamond, who's unable to understand this. So she says, I can't guess. We used to play at guessing historical characters at Mrs. Lemon's, but not anatomists. So, the reference here is to Vesalius and, his cutting up of the bodies at night. So the only way he could get to know anatomy as he did was by going to snatch bodies at night from graveyards and places of execution. That is what Lydgate tells us, and which of course resonates with Lydgate's own desire of actually analyzing the corpses, something that was not allowed around that time. So, and Rosamond is, completely disgusted, and she says that, well, I'm quoting from the novel. She says, I'm very glad you're not Vesalius. I should have thought he might find some less horrible way than that. And if you look at Rosamond's quote, and here this is very important. There was a moment's pause before Rosamond said, do you know, Tertius, I often wish you had not been a medical man. Now, if Lydgate, with his desire for medical reform, with his desire for experimenting, if he were not a medical man, then he would be nothing, because he doesn't understand being anything else. And so, look at Lydgate's response to Rosamond. Nay, Rosie, don't say that, said Lydgate, drawing her closer to him. That is like saying you wish you had married another man. So on the one hand, this exchange shows us the complete gap, the complete lacuna that is there in this marriage, and at the same time, it shows us the intense desire that Lydgate has to bring in reform, and yet the spots of commonness that prevent him from achieving, really speaking, realizing his dream and achieving great heights. So there is Lillian first raises this question: why does so exceptionally well qualified a doctor opt to settle in Middlemarch? It is characteristic of both Lydgate's boldness and lack of expediency that he follows none of the conventional routes. He makes a deliberate decision to keep away from the range of London intrigues, and because he regards the medical profession as, within quotes, presenting the most perfect interchange between science and art. Lydgate plans by settling in a provincial town to do good small work for Middlemarch and great work for the world. So, first here is actually drawing attention to this, zeal for reform, medical reform in Lydgate. But very important here is a question that first raises about, and in one of the lectures we will be discussing first in greater detail, the question that first asks, why does so qualified a doctor opt to settle in Middlemarch? What happens to this doctor in Middlemarch is equally important, because remember, this is a novel about provincial lives. So, remember that in the 19th century, especially in the first part, there was a tripartite division. You had the physicians, surgeons, and apothecaries. And you did not have a well-qualified general practitioner. Now, this profession was also hierarchical. At the top, you had the physicians, and they were governed by the Royal College of Physicians. And I'm using all this information from Lillian First's article. And then the prestige of the physician was important in the sense that he used his head and not his hands. He's using his mind, so in that sense, a physician is superior. At the opposite end of the spectrum was the apothecary, who was closely linked to the trade, and they would get a license that was obtained by apprenticeship. But they were, of course, at the bottom in this hierarchy. And in the middle are the surgeons, right? The apothecaries as tradesmen were far beneath the physicians, right? And of course, in the middle you have the surgeons. Now, Lydgate is introduced to Middlemarch society as a young, new surgeon. So, but what is he doing? He's not simply using his hands, he is using his mind. So he's also, in a sense, flouting this tripartite division that existed between the physicians, who were at the top, and then you had the surgeons, and then the apothecary. So the problematic category was that of the surgeons, and they were, as I said, poised midway, really speaking, between the physicians and the apothecaries. Now, in these two books then, reform takes a new turn. So, Lydgate, safely married, he has the hospital under his command, and he's struggling in a sense for medical reform. You have Ladislaw, who's establishing himself as a writer. He's writing all these articles and is talking about political reform. And there is this argument between Ladislaw and Lydgate. And Ladislaw says something very important. He says, he questions Lydgate and says, why don't you extend your liberality to others? If you want to be liberal in the field of medical reform, why don't you extend it to politics? He says, my personal independence is as important to me as yours is to you. You have no more reason to imagine that I have personal expectations from Brooke. The reference here is to Brooke contesting the local elections. So, I have to imagine that you have personal expectations from Bulstrode. So, motives are points of honor, and nobody can prove them but as to money and place in the world. So, And in this world to which, the Middlemarch belong, really speaking, references to railways, reform bill, the cholera, the horrors of cholera, that had taken place at this time, and all these were very, very important. So in this provincial society, you have a lot of discussion that's going on. Discussion about the viability of railways, discussion about reform bill, discussion about the horrors of cholera, and women, old and young, regarded travelling by steam as presumptuous and dangerous, and argued against it. So George Eliot deliberately places herself within provincial society and is looking at, I wouldn't say the limitations, but I would say the negotiation of provincial society with modernity. Modernity that, as you can see, is coming to us now through many quarters, from the steam engine, right? From women's refusal to, travel by steam, that's coming in through reform and so on, right? Now, this also, as is pointed out in an earlier lecture, is a novel that lays great emphasis on wills, the legality of the whole idea of inheritance, and, with Peter Featherstone's death, and in a sense, the disinheritance of Fred Vincy from the legacy of Peter Featherstone is important. But another very important will is that of Edward Casaubon, where he kind of adds a codicil to the will. Now, it was another rather fuller sort of companionship that Dorothea was hungering for, and the hunger had grown. She was always trying to be what her husband wanted, right? Now, and it is to this kind of a woman who was kind of totally dedicated, in a sense, that, he alters his will. Now, Dorothea, of course, never refuses anything, and whatever it is that he, really speaking, requires, she provides all that. But he makes a codicil to his will before he dies, and the property was to be taken away from Dorothea in case she married Will Ladislaw. Now, to this point, Dorothea herself has not realized what it is that, draws her towards Will Ladislaw. But this is a clear indication, and it is almost a reflection, that she probably has an intention of marrying Will Ladislaw, that she has an intention of marrying Will Ladislaw. So Celia informs her of this codicil, and she is absolutely disgusted and absolutely aghast. But it also shows us how through this codicil, how through this will, Edward Casaubon continues to control Dorothea's life even after his own death, right? How the legality of it all in a patriarchal society suits the men. So Celia says that, if you married Will Ladislaw, nobody else. And of course, that is of no consequence. You would never marry, but that only makes it worse of Mr. Casaubon. That only makes it worse of Mr. Casaubon. So, on the one hand, is this kind of a frame that has been, in a sense, created for Dorothea Brooke. And on the other hand, you have Will Ladislaw, who's, kind of supporting the cause of our dear friend, Mr. Brooke, who plans to stand for the elections. And look at the view of the society of Middlemarch that is given to us by George Eliot. Weavers, tanners, unlike Mr. Momsey, had never thought of Mr. Brooke as a neighbor. Because one of the things that goes against Mr. Brooke is that he's never bothered about his tenants and the way they are, and the conditions in which they are living. And here he's talking about reform and elections and so on. So they never considered him to be a neighbor, and they listened without much disturbance to the speakers who introduced the candidate, a political personage who came to tell Middlemarch its duty. And so when he starts speaking, he says, "Gentlemen electors of Middlemarch," right? And a little later, one of the people says from the crowd, "Blast your ideas, we want the bill." So, what is it that these people want? I mean, look at it, references to weavers and tanners and, their attitude to Mr. Brooke. They don't see him as a neighbor, they see him as somebody who's contesting, but he says, "Blast your ideas. What is it that we want?" They say, We want the bill. So, in this sense, if you're really speaking, look at the novel, Bulstrode's, sins, of course, come to revisit him in the form of Raffles, and married to a Mrs. Dunkirk, he conceals from her the knowledge of her daughter Sarah, that is Will Ladislaw's mother, who had run away, and Will Ladislaw, of course, is equally later, when he gets to know about the money that Bulstrode is willing to offer him, and he rejects it. But at the same time, you have Lydgate, who's now seeing a decline in his personal life because he's now very hard up on finances. And 18 months ago, Lydgate, and I quote from the novel, 18 months ago, Lydgate was poor but had never known the eager want of sums. But the way in which Rosamund Vincy, who's shown to be very whimsical and has been spending the money, asks him a simple question. "What can I do, Tertius?" said Rosamund. And in this one line, it's almost as if 4 words, that little speech of 4 words, like so many others, is capable by very vocal inflections of expressing all states of mind. And Lydgate doesn't know what to do. He did not storm in indignation, he felt sad. Because "what can I do, Tertius?" is also a realization of, on Lydgate's part, that Rosamund is certainly not going to understand what is happening. So this was not really speaking one of the sales, there is a reference in this novel also to an auction. And it tells us about how this auction is not really speaking about a depression, but it is due to a great success that Mr. Larcher, who's moving to a bigger house, is selling whatever he has, really speaking, his purchased mansion. And so he's really speaking, selling what he has. It shows the growth of people, how they're moving on. Right, and this is the kind of financial growth that one has already seen in Bulstrode, who has also deprived Will Ladislaw of, the money that he really speaking was to inherit. So, and it's not due to legal punishment or beggary, but he's apprehensive about, what this is going to really speaking mean for him. When his family, when the society finds out. So the image that he has created, the mournful perception of his wife and facts of his past life would render him an object of scorn and opprobrium, of course, also in terms of religion. So, which is why he makes that offering to Will Ladislaw. At the same time, remember that he's not informing, the housekeeper of the instructions that had been given to him by Lydgate vis-a-vis Raffles, and something that leads to Raffles's death is something that needs to be kept in mind, because that is also later going to lead to Lydgate's own downfall. Now, what Will Ladislaw says here is important. He says, "My unblemished honor." He thinks about Dorothea. And he says that his unblemished honor is important for him because his mother had run away from a family that was stealing, right? So, and she, was a performer on stage and so on, and she lived her life on her own terms. So he says, "I find there is a stain that I cannot help. My mother felt it and tried to keep us clear of it." So he says, "You shall keep your ill-gotten money." And here, in rejecting the offer made by Bulstrode, Ladislaw is asserting himself. I think as a character in this novel, this is a moment of great assertion. So he says, if he had disproved what you had told me, he says, "What I have to thank you for is that you kept the money till now. When I can refuse it, it ought to lie with the man's self that he's a gentleman." So book 6 in that sense ends as Will leaves Middlemarch, and so in this sense it ends on this note of assertion. All in all, what then is the view that we have of different people and the provincial life of Middlemarch? What is the view of society? So we discussed reform, we discussed element of modernity, the reluctance of people to accept modernity, and how important, how there is a complete collapse, of course, between Rosamund and Lydgate, and his decline begins, and which of course is multiplied with the death of Raffles. At the same time, Will leaves Middlemarch, and Will Ladislaw's assertion is something that we are, really speaking, left with in this novel. So really speaking, we have to understand that Ladislaw's assertion of honor, his idea of his dedication in a sense to political reform and rejection of this money, I think the two things, really speaking, need to be looked at together. And then, as I said, with these two novels, and of course, if you look at, we've been analyzing consistently the Dorothea Casaubon relationship. We need to see how really speaking, the institution of marriage absolutely collapses, because the marriage, really speaking, between Dorothea and Casaubon was never close to being successful. But with Casaubon's death, in a sense, Casaubon's own insecurity and how he has absolutely tried to control Dorothea's life. I think that is a very important aspect, and is a reflection on the institution of marriage and the way in which it controls women and determines the course of their life. On the other hand, the complete, financial loss that Lydgate and Rosamond are experiencing, and so much so that Rosamond at one point comes and puts her jewels, and Lydgate realizes that he cannot take this away from her, but also will not take money, from anybody else. So he does not know what to do. And then, these two sets of relationships aside, when we actually move on further and look at the society, I think these two books have enough references to politics, history, to the Reform Bill, to show us how modernity is actually getting into provincial lives, how it is getting into provincial society, and how there is a degree of resistance. It's never an easy road. There is a degree of resistance, yet at the same time, there are people like Dorothea, there are people like Lydgate who have idealism in them and would like to bring in reform into this world. So this is a very, very organic sort of a society, really speaking. I think we've been also talking about narrative technique. It's important to understand that there is a sense of organicity to George Eliot's narrative technique, and of course, a relationship between the microcosm and the macrocosm that allows us to understand and get a realistic view of society of the times. Thank you.